Dad told me a terrifying story about Grandma, and my repressed childhood memories are slowly returning. I've not seen my grandmother since 2009. Following a catastrophic argument with Dad, she moved away. I only found out when I cycled past her house and saw a "for sale" sign. My father was elusive about what transpired between them, but I knew that it was something awful. A mother and a son won't drift apart on wayward tides. It took willful rowing to put distance between them. Naturally, I wanted to see Grandma. I wanted to know what had been said or done to alter our family. I assumed that she had told Dad her new address, so I would beg him to let me visit her. However, he refused my requests. So, several years ago, I did a little detective work and opened a letter addressed to Dad. I recognised Grandma's handwriting from birthday cards I'd received over the years. My father scolded me for rummaging through his post, of course. After that, his mail was delivered to a separate P.O. box, preventing me from intercepting any more letters.
Dear John, please forgive me. Mum, XX.
That was all the letter said. Unfortunately, there was no return address. When Mum died in 2018, I stopped asking about Grandma. Grieving became our sole focus. For a long time, I only thought about my mother. She'd been struggling psychologically for years, and she was missing for a few months before somebody found her body. I don't really want to talk about that. I was simply giving some context for the horror to come. To understate everything, it has been a painful few years. I'm 24, and I haven't asked Dad about Grandma since I was a teenager. Truthfully, I decided a while ago that life had to continue. Dad's life had to continue. Pressuring him to dredge up an old bust-up felt unloving. I didn't need to know what had happened with Grandma. The ship had sailed. My father is the only family I have left, so I didn't want to irreparably ruin our relationship by persistently badgering him about his mother. But last night, something unexpected happened.
Cara?
Dad shouted from the living room.
Come here. Sit with me for a minute.
Gulping, I tentatively entered the room and chose an armchair opposite the sofa on which he slouched. I was panicking because I thought it might be time for a talk about me still living at home. I finished university a couple of years ago, and I've got a job in sales, but it doesn't pay nearly well enough for me to move out.
You okay, Dad?
I asked. He sighed. Yeah, I'm fine. But I've been thinking lately.
Uh-oh.
I teased, hoping a classic dad joke might relieve some tension. You've not asked me about Grandma for years, he said after a long pause. I was flabbergasted. Dad hadn't mentioned his mum since their unexplained estrangement. I hardly knew how to respond. After several awkward seconds, I realised that I was simply sitting there, mouth agape, staring silently. My father adjusted his reading glasses, which were perched precariously atop his clammy nose, barrelling down the slope. He looked anxious. Is this finally it? I wondered. I'm coming to terms with things, Cara. After all, you're old enough to go out and make your own decisions, Dad said. And I often find myself wondering whether you still want to see your Grandma. I shrugged. I stopped asking about her because I could see how much it upset you. Dad smiled weakly. I know, Cara. I know. I appreciate it. We've been through a lot. But what I'm saying is that I'm aware of your age. You're an adult now. I worry sometimes that you might go off and try to find her. I'm sure you'd struggle because your grandma doesn't want to be found, but, well, she might try to contact you. Maybe she already has tried? I shook my head. She hasn't, Dad. His rigid posture seemed to ease. Good, that's good. However, if I really want to keep you safe, I have to tell you why you shouldn't contact your grandma. I nodded. It would help to know why you two fell out. It was Dad's turn to gulp. He shifted his body weight in his seat, stalling for time. I found my eyes wandering to the night sky outside our living room window. Torrential rain pummeled the tarmac of our sleepy road, and a solitary lamppost was scarcely visible through the cascading curtain of droplets on the glass. Your grandma and granddad always had a strained relationship, Dad eventually started. That's why I have so many issues, I think. I just hope none of that resentment rubbed off on you, Cara. My mum and dad were always good to me, but they weren't good to each other, and they seemed oblivious to the effect that had on me as a child. I smiled gently. I remembered Grandma and Grandad bickering throughout my early childhood. And then one day, my grandfather left her. I always told Mum that she was a bit too harsh on Dad for his long business trips. He was just trying to provide for us. But when he left her, I obviously empathised and took her side. So I don't want you thinking of me as the bad guy, Dad said. I shook my head. Never. I'm dancing around the subject. You only have one question, I imagine, Dad said. What changed? I shook my head again. Dad, you don't have to tell. I do, he interrupted. If you stop me now, I might never summon the courage again. Okay. I found something shortly after your granddad left. I was clearing out your grandma's attic and there was a cardboard box labelled the catalogue. It was full of photos. My dad paused, voice croaking. Photos of missing people, I later learned. And every person's story was the same. These candid photographs were taken from a distance, in parks and busy shopping centres, men and women. That wasn't what scared me, it was the photographs taken in the attic. Unimaginable brutality. I won't say any more than that. Quaking at a revelation I never expected to leave my father's lips, I sat in silence, processing the horrifying information. My mental cogs were turning, but I hadn't realised what I was still repressing. When I confronted your grandma about it, she burst into tears, Dad hoarsely whispered. She said it was the reason Grandad left. He discovered her secret. Obviously, I told my mum that I was going straight to the police, and she just said she understood. She didn't try to stop me. But she fled that very night. And 14 years later, there's still no sign of her. I just hope, wherever she went, she stopped hurting people. And that was it. My dad's terrible story. I didn't find any suitable words, so I stopped searching for any. We both sat for a prolonged period of silence, watching the rain continue to beat down on the world outside. A world which suddenly looked a little darker to me. Eventually, I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. My head was whirring, though not for the reasons one might expect. You see, Dad's story didn't fully add up. I remembered something. I used to stay at my grandparents' house from time to time, and they'd often let me bring a friend or two, given that I was an only child, and they didn't want me to have a boring sleepover with two oldies. They knew who I'd invite. It was always the same two girls, Sophie and Francesca. In fact, Grandma and Grandad often insisted on me inviting my best friends. And my pals loved my grandparents. Well, mainly, they loved the sweets that Grandma and Grandad would give us before bed. Plying us with succulent, sugary goodness should have stimulated our minds, kept us awake. Yet, we slept like babies. Not every time. One night, when I was around 6 or 7 years old, I woke in the early hours of the morning. It was still dark outside, and I felt unbelievably groggy, as if someone had snapped an elastic band around my brain to restrict the blood flow. After a few seconds, I became aware of my surroundings. Francesca was fast asleep, but Sophie's sleeping bag was empty, and the door to my bedroom, Dad's old room, was wide open. I eyeballed the pitch-black upstairs landing through the doorway. My eyesight was hazy, though I'm sure I wouldn't have been able to see a thing anyway. My ears, on the other hand, were working perfectly. That must have been what stirred me from my sleep. The sound of creaking floorboards above my head, wooden groans from the attic. My immediate thought was that Sophie was messing around up there, and I worried that I was about to be in big trouble with my grandparents. So I gingerly rose to my feet, almost passing out as I did, and I tiptoed quietly out of my bedroom, preparing to navigate the blackened landing. I didn't use any lights, as it might have alerted Grandma or Grandad, but the moaning sounds of the attic floorboards persisted, along with a muffled voice, so I knew it was only a matter of time before my grandparents woke up anyway.
Sophie!
I hissed, hoping she would hear and my grandparents wouldn't. The creaking immediately stopped, and I held my breath as I finally accepted something. Those sounds are too loud to be Sophie's footsteps. I rushed back to bed as floorboards, like oak piano keys, creaked along the length of the ceiling. I managed to slither under my duvet and squeeze my eyelids together as the attic door opened with a giant roar. It was followed by the sound of someone heavily clambering down the ladder. I remember striving feverishly to feign that I was asleep as the unknown figure lumbered across the landing. I kept my eyes shut, trying not to cry as I listened to the strained breathing of the figure who had stopped in the doorway. The figure who was clearly watching me. I didn't need to open my eyes to know that. It wasn't Sophie. It was the boogeyman. The monster padded clumsily into the room, dropped something heavy on the floor, and walked over to my bed. I still remember that stale, unclean breath on my face. I was trembling beneath the cover, but I held my nerve and prayed the creature wouldn't eat me. After a minute or so, it slowly backed out of the room. Closing the bedroom door behind it. I waited for a long time before I opened my eyes. Sophie was lying atop her sleeping bag, seemingly unconscious. She must have been unaware of what happened to her. I hope so. Her hair was dishevelled, and it looked different. At the time, I didn't understand that. I know now, of course, but I was too young to know then. There was something wrong with those sweets, just as there was something wrong with Grandma and Grandad insisting that I invite Sophie and Francesca. But I haven't been entirely truthful. I remember something else. Something that unravels part of my dad's story. It wasn't Grandma who invited my friends and gave us sweets. It was Grandad. This morning, I returned to my old ways of badgering Dad. "You must know more," I said. Grandma might still be harming people." My dad scowled. "Chiara, please. She'd be a very old woman by now. She'll be gone from this world soon. Let's just forget about all of this. I thought you'd stop asking questions if I were to finally tell you the whole story." But it's not the whole story, I thought. "You must have read some of the letters she sent. Maybe she left clues," I said. "I read all of them, sweetie, and I took them straight to the police. She hasn't written to me in about 5 years. Please, drop it," Dad pleaded. "I'm sorry, but I'm struggling to get it out of my head. I keep thinking of those poor people, how they suffered. And this is coming from me. I didn't even see the photos. I don't know what things she did. It must be far worse for you, Dad. You must want to do something." "Lovely guilt tripping," Dad said. "Yes, I do want to do something, Cara. That's exactly why I've been helping the police for years. I'm not protecting her. She may be my mother, but what she did to those people... Yeah, you're right. You don't know what she did. But I wouldn't want you to know. No human being could do those things." "Sorry," I whispered. "That was a cruel move. I just feel horrible knowing she's out there. And like you said, I'm an adult. I make my own decisions. So I want you to know that I'm not going to let this lie. I'm going to look for her." I expected Dad to shout at me, but he didn't. He sat thoughtfully at the kitchen table, twiddling his spoon in the bowl of cereal before him, and I waited patiently for a response. Yet again, he surprised me. "I'll tell you something else," he finally said. I perked up, leaning across the table inquisitively. "The lead detective would come by regularly," Dad continued. "He'd ask questions, I'd help with the investigation. Mum and I kept you out of that, so I doubt you remember him. Detective Simon Smith. He kept me updated, and he told me about the immediate connection he drew after the police finally poured through the thousands of photos. There were 36 victims, and every single one was brunette. Could have been a wild coincidence, but the lead detective didn't think so. Serial killers often have a pattern, after all. And she was a very unwell lady." I instantly shuddered. Another horrifying memory emerged from the fractured recesses of my mind. A memory that I didn't have the stomach to share with my father. Around the age of 8, I distinctly remember waking from a sleepover at my grandparents' house to find a chunk of my hair, my brunette hair, missing. It had been sloppily chopped from the left side of my head during the night. I remember blaming Francesca, as she was the main prankster out of the 3 of us, but she blamed Sophie. Neither of them owned up to it. I got in big trouble with my parents for that one. I really hope Dad doesn't remember that, or he'd probably put 2 and 2 together. That memory helps me to understand why my grandfather insisted that I should invite Sophie and Francesca. They were both brunette too. I had a blonde friend called Lucy who would come over to play from time to time, but the invitation was never extended to her. It all makes me feel disgusting. Well, anyway, I doubt that helps you, Dad said. But then we're not police officers, are we, pet? Best to leave it to the professionals. Are you not going to tell me about anything you read in the letters? I asked. Look, I know you've never believed me, Chiara, but Grandma didn't give me any details as to her whereabouts, Dad said. She didn't want to be found, I've told you this. And what did she write in the letters? I asked. Dad shrugged. Nothing that was ever of much use to the police, in all fairness. But I gave them the evidence anyway. Your grandma mostly requested forgiveness. And she asked questions about you, of course. About your mother, too. It made me angry when she spoke about the two of you. Maybe she was worried about us, I replied, without thinking about the words that had left my mouth. Dad raised an eyebrow at me. Chiara, I know she was your grandma and you loved her, but she wasn't the kind woman you believed her to be. That was a lie. A facade she maintained for decades. It's taken me many years to come to terms with that. So I understand that it might take time for you too. I just don't want you to live in denial, darling. I nodded my head, dejected at the prospect of never having any closure. But then my dad, as always, dropped the biggest bombshell as an afterthought. I suppose, well, in one letter, she did write something that reminded me of my childhood. She said, what did she say? Love you, my North Angel. I miss your happy times. Something like that. She used to call me her North Angel whenever we visited Gateshead. Actually, I think we all went as a family, didn't we? I nodded. I remembered Grandma calling me the exact same thing. The detective contacted police in Gateshead, but nothing ever came of that lead, Dad said, shrugging. But the quote was far more significant to me. Dad was forgetting something. So I excused myself and headed upstairs to the main bathroom. Atop a forgotten shelf, it still stood. The rather large Angel of the North figurine that Grandma had bought on our holiday. A souvenir to remember happy times. She said that to all of us. Happy times. Those words were used again in the letter to Dad. It seemed a bizarre reference to make. However, after I lifted the figurine and looked at the bottom, everything made sense. A slip of paper was glued to the ornament, hidden for years. It read, John, something's wrong. You should know that by the time you read this. If not, you might have stumbled upon it by accident. I suppose that would be better than it sitting unnoticed for years. Whatever the case, you need to tell the police that your grandfather is going to Devon. Remember your dad's old caravan? That's where we'll be. He's leaving Lancaster soon, and I'll follow when the time's right. It's the only way he'll spare them. I don't know what else to do to protect you. He's always watching, even now. Don't let him know that you found this note. Don't say anything to him. I don't have time to write anymore. I've already spent too long in here. Heart racing, I immediately crumpled the piece of paper and shoved it in my pocket. I didn't want Dad to find out. Too much had changed since Grandma had written that note. My father was a broken man, and he wouldn't have been able to handle it. But this is perhaps one of the most perturbing pieces of the puzzle. Grandad forced Grandma to take the blame for his crimes, but then he forced her to join him? He threatened our safety. Even though the note dated back to 2009, I knew that I had to go to Devon. I also knew that Grandma and Grandad might both be long gone, but I wasn't going to let this awfulness rest without finding out the truth for myself. Unfortunately, I knew exactly where to find the caravan. That was another family holiday Dad's parents had repeated with me when I was a child. My father was already at work, and I took a sick day. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I jumped into my car, set the destination, and drove for 5 brutal hours from Lancaster to Devon. When I arrived, it wasn't quite the picturesque place I remembered. England has been bombarded with torrential showers over the past couple of days, and today's sky was painted a murky, near colourless grey. The horizon was an endless expanse of nothingness, footed by rolling hills. And in the midst of a mostly neglected caravan park, there stood a rusty, forlorn, static home. Grandad's caravan. Yes, it was still there. And as I exited my car, all-encompassing terror descended. The realization of what I was doing. I wasn't telling stories with my dad in the comforts of our room. This was real. I was standing before the home of the boogeyman. My boots squelched in the sodden muck of the footpath leading up to the caravan's front door. Rain fell mercilessly, but I was glad. The deafening sound of the downpour drowned out my footsteps. I had the element of surprise on my side. And when I reached the front door, I took several long, measured breaths before finally knocking on it. To my surprise, with a single knock, it swung open. I knew I shouldn't step inside. The lightless lair of the beast terrified me more than any of my childhood sleepovers. The knowledge of his heinous crimes of a real-life man, made me fear him more than any imaginary monster. I bravely moved one foot in front of the other and crossed the threshold. Clearly nobody had stepped foot in that place for a few years, at the very least. The walls were black. No light seeped through the curtains. There were mould-covered plates in the kitchen sink, circled by eager flies. And I screamed as a rat scurried from a cupboard, disappearing somewhere into the filth of the house.
Grandma?
I called. I don't know why I announced myself. I suppose I'd already accepted that nobody could possibly be living there. I should have just called the police like she suggested in the note, I thought. But if I'd done that, I would have forfeited my one chance of finding any sort of evidence. I was tired of people hiding the truth from me. I pressed onwards, flipping any light switch I could find. Nothing. Probably the result of unpaid electricity bills. Another good sign that nobody had lived there for a while. Instead, I fumbled in my pocket for my phone and used the flashlight. I wish I hadn't. The open-plan living area, comprising of a kitchen and 2 sofas, was spacious for a static home. It took up most of the caravan's floor area. 30 by 10 feet. Humongous. And every inch of the walls, every single inch, was coated in hair. 100,000 pieces of brunette locks. Most strands were red-tinged, and the demonic decoration was knotted in a crisscrossed pattern, forming an intricate blanket. The interwoven pain of a nightmarish man's victims. Terrified and sickened beyond words, I bent over and hurled onto the floor. Thankful, at least, to be eyeing something other than the horror which coated the walls. I quickly turned my flashlight to the corridor, which led to the back of the static home. I'd seen enough. and the sooner I could say I'd checked all of the caravan, the better. The bathroom was another mouldy, forgotten space. Hairless, thankfully. So, I moved towards the final room of the house. The bedroom. A room emanating a stench so powerful that I feared it more than the horror behind me. I didn't want to open the door. I really didn't. But I had to do it. Handle in my sweaty palm, I lightly pushed the door. Vomit bubbled to the top of my throat again as I found another room lined with meticulously intertwined hair. Hair that covered not only the walls, but the floor, the furnishings, and the entirety of the bed. The entirety of the room. But that wasn't what horrified me most. What horrified me was the hairy lump merging with the bedding. Grandma. Little more than bones, though I only assumed that to be the case, because she too was covered entirely in hair. There was no way of identifying the body. Still, I didn't have to get close to know she was dead, and I didn't want to get close. Grandma was interlaced with the bed's hand-woven brunette duvet, which had spread like a fungus throughout the interior of the house. I don't know whether it would have been better or worse to instead see the corpse beneath. I turned to run, but on my way out, I noticed the wardrobe door was ever so slightly ajar. It beckoned me, though I knew great horrors lay within. Still, questions needed to be answered. It was why I travelled so far. I wasn't going to turn back. Stepping onto the soft, hair-blanketed floor, I walked towards the wardrobe and pushed the door fully open. I gasped. The catalogue. Those words were printed on a slim slip of paper, which was attached to the inner door of the empty wooden wardrobe, and a new collection of photos had been glued to the back panel. Photos of me. Photographs of me in clubs. A photo of my first day at university in Manchester, back in 2017. Even a photo of me sleeping. He broke into my dorm and watched me sleep. I thought I had an empty stomach, but I surprised myself, unleashing another horror-driven stream of bile across the floor. After a few minutes of laboured breathing, I collected myself and returned my gaze to the inside of the wardrobe. At least he's fixated on me, I told myself, praying that my granddad wouldn't have taken the lives of anyone else. But that wasn't true. On the inside of the other door, there was another collection of candid shots. Pictures of my mother. Last night, after calling the police from Grandad's caravan, I returned home, and I told my father everything. He took my phone and started scrolling through the photos I'd taken. "Oh God," Dad cried, pushing the phone back into my hands. "Do you think," I started, gulping, "do you think Grandad might be responsible for what happened to Mum?" Dad winced sharply. "Cara, I don't know whether I have the strength to grieve for your mother twice." I understand why he'd prefer to believe that Mum took her own life, rather than believe that someone took it from her. And perhaps I didn't want the police to uncover the truth either. Perhaps I had nothing left to give. What I will say, however, is that Mum's death in 2018, though seemingly self-inflicted, was unfathomably awful. A mangled corpse in a car wreck. And I wondered why she'd want to end her life so painfully. I'd wondered that for a long time. Today, I finally received answers. Every terrible answer. I took another sick day, and I spent it flicking through my pictures. I kept stopping on the photo of me sleeping in my university dorm. "He's always watching." That was what Grandma wrote in her note. Did Grandad travel all of the way up here to stalk us? Did he frequently make that 5-hour journey? Before returning to his Devon hideout? Possibly. And then he coerced his wife, made her join him in that terrible place. He must have abandoned the caravan after killing her. Where is he now? I shuddered. There was a picture of Mum driving on the motorway. A picture Grandad had taken whilst he was driving too. He was following her, only 20 yards behind her car. In the picture, I could see the dashboard of Grandad's vehicle, and his left hand on the steering wheel. His wrist donned a gleaming golden Rolex, but most importantly, the photo captured his BMW's askew hood ornament. Distinctly askew. A sinking feeling consumed me. "Dad?" I said. My father lifted his head from the newspaper he'd been holding for several hours. He clearly wasn't reading any of the words. I could tell from his haunted face that his mind was swimming with the horrifying revelations I'd spilled that morning. Yes, he asked. "Is this the car you're always mentioning?" I asked, showing him the photo of Grandad's BMW. My dad's eyes widened, and he slowly nodded at me, face turning a ghostly shade. For the past few years, he'd been moaning, on and off, about a BMW with that exact shabby ornament loitering in our village. It was often parked illegally, and people had complained about a strange man sitting there for hours. But the car always moved before anyone did anything about it. "I know you called him last night, but I think we need to phone the police again," Dad whispered. I trembled, feeling more than a little queasy. Dad didn't remember when or where he'd last seen the vehicle. As I said, his memory is awful. But I remembered that only a month or so earlier, he moaned about it being parked on a double yellow line around the corner from our street. I finally accepted that Grandad had been here for years. Whilst my dad talked to the police, I continued to scroll through the photos. Every picture of my mother and me had been taken at night. Grandad used the flashlight on his phone or the headlights of his car to illuminate his surroundings. And that made me think of other unusual things from the past few years. For instance, I always forget to draw my curtains before bed. Foolish given that I'm a light sleeper. And there were numerous occasions on which I was rudely awakened in the early hours of the morning. A car's blinding full-beam headlights would fill my small room. Every time I'd grumpily get up and draw my curtains, that wouldn't completely block out the light from the road. But the car, strangely, would always drive away shortly afterwards, as if there were no point in loitering without being able to see through my window. I'm absent-minded. I've established that. I would wake to find my bedroom door ever so slightly ajar. I'm fairly certain I rarely forgot to close it at night. These days, I remember slightly more often than I used to. And all of that terrified me more than anything. The thought that Grandad entered our house came close enough to touch me. "Thank you, officer," my dad said, hanging up the phone and turning to me. "The detective is going to keep an eye out for a car that matches the description. As for the broader investigation into Dad's location, they're looking at missing person cases from recent years. The officer's going to come over here and talk about a temporary measure. He wants to move us somewhere safer, Cara. Somewhere Grandad won't be able to find us." We have to hide, I asked, trembling. Dad hugged me. I know you're scared, Kara, but it's gonna be okay. It'll just be until the investigation wraps up. But you've done an amazing thing here, finding all of this evidence. I'm not cross that you went to the caravan. I'm not. I understand why you did it. It's nearly over. If your grandfather lives around here, he has to be found. It has to happen sooner or later. The police have everything under control. I truly believe that. As we waited for Detective Simon Smith, I kept thinking about the fact that the police didn't seem to have anything under control. They'd known of this horror for 14 years, and they were no closer to solving anything. They'd been searching for the wrong person until I corrected them. Half an hour after Dad's phone call, a dingy brown Ford Focus pulled onto our driveway. The man who got out of the car must have been in his early 30s, though his coarse skin aged him. He had thinning hair, but a neatly trimmed beard, and he wore a grey trench coat. The man tightened his black gloves as he approached us. "Nice to see you again, John," the detective said, shaking hands with my father. "Same to you, Simon," Dad replied. "Has it been 4 years?" Detective Smith nodded. "Yeah, about that. I'm sorry it's been so long. The case was admittedly gathering dust until yesterday's discovery. And this is Kara, I presume?" I nodded my head before shaking the man's hand. "I'm really sorry, Kara," Simon said somberly. "What you saw in that caravan was something nobody should ever have to see. But you're incredibly brave and undoubtedly very smart. The career in detective work might be on the cards for you, eh?" I smiled weakly, struggling to speak. "Right, well, I think the first thing we should do is find alternative accommodation for the two of you," Simon said. "I'm sorry about this, but it's for your own safety, until we find him." "But he'll just follow us," I protested. "He won't, I assure you," Simon replied. "I'll be checking my tail the whole way." "How long will we have to stay away?" Dad asked. "What if you never find my father?" Simon shook his head. "We'll find him, John. You've been a massive help with this investigation. One of my colleagues located a BMW matching a description on several recent CCTV tapes from business owners in town. It won't be long before your father rears his head." Realising that arguing was futile, I went upstairs and packed a bag. 10 minutes later, Dad and I walked with Detective Smith to his battered Ford Focus. "So, where are you taking us?" my father asked as we clambered inside and buckled our seatbelts. A travel lodge in Manchester," Simon replied. "With any luck, we'll find him within the month. He's leaving a trail, and I don't think he even realises that. Doubt he's kept up with modern technology, modern ways of tracking people." Simon seemed naive to me. As we set off, I watched my quaint village swim past the passenger side window. The sun was setting, but the sky was still a calming blue. A settled, safe world surrounded me, in contrast to the rainy, chaotic week which preceded it. "How did you do it, Kara?" Simon asked. I looked away from my window. "Huh? How did you find out where to find your granddad?" the detective asked. I shrugged, nervously locking eyes with him in the rearview mirror. "Grandma left clues." Simon chuckled, parroting what I'd said. Grandma left clues. Remarkable. "I'm serious, you should really join the force. You're a damn sight better at this than me." It It was as the car turned sharply onto a country road that I first noticed it. The sleeve of Simon's trench coat lifted as he steered to the left, and it revealed something beneath his black glove. A golden Rolex. My stomach immediately lurched. Won't this way take us longer? We should have turned right to head towards Manchester. It's a quicker route, my dad pointed out. The detective didn't reply. We found ourselves on a bumpy, disused road, dwarfed on either side by looming oak trees. The daylight was fading, and I was gripped by unimaginable terror, completely unable to say anything, unable to process what I'd seen. Simon? Where are we going? My father asked. Dad? I finally managed to croak. I want to go home. You are home, Cara, Simon whispered. The detective brought the Ford Focus to a halt in the middle of a wooded clearing. Far from civilization. Far from anything but a small, lightless shack. And then there was a clicking noise. What? Dad began. Get out of the car, Simon replied, pointing what I realised to be a handgun at my father. Dad gasped. What? I won't tell you again, Simon warned. As my dad shakily opened the door, Simon aimed the pistol at me. His eyes were as untamed as his damaged hair. You too, Miss Detective, he spat. Get out. Dad opened the door for me, and we embraced as Simon quickly slipped out of the driver's side to resume pointing the gun at us. Walk in front of me, he ordered. Head towards the front door and do not run. I didn't dare look back at the lunatic. I huddled closely to my father and prayed that the hellish experience would end. Our feet were barely visible in the pitch-black forest, but we managed to stumble towards the front path of the shack. Open the door, John, Simon said. My dad lightly pushed the rickety wooden door, and it opened onto a black chasm. Move, Simon growled. We can't see, Dad explained. Something prodded me in the back, and I turned slightly to see a torch in Simon's spare hand. He eyed me coldly until I took it. I was afraid to use it, because part of me already knew what I would see. But it was worse, so much worse than the caravan. As the torch sprang to life, my dad yelled. I screamed inwardly, but I was just as horrified to be faced with rotten walls, mostly covered in black hair. Still, I didn't want to give Simon the satisfaction of seeing my fear. However, I'm sure he knew it was there. He must have seen it in my eyes. What I hadn't expected was to find floorboards that were stained dark red. I know what it must have been, but there was just so much of it. Too much of it. I'll tell you a secret, Simon gleefully whispered in my ear, pointing at the walls. Underneath that soft, silky brunette wallpaper, you'll find a sturdy underlayer of smooth, skin-covered plaster. I uttered an involuntary yelp. Simon giggled. Don't worry, Cara. It decays, as do all beautiful things. We can always go downstairs for more, but don't you worry about downstairs. My dad and I embraced one another again. Right. Head to the end of the corridor, the detective barked. What are you doing, Simon? Dad asked as we walked along the hair-walled, bloody-floored hallway of a derelict bungalow. "Don't ask me," Simon replied, nodding at the door ahead. I shone the torch on the door handle, and my dad obliged Simon's request, twisting it. As the door lightly creaked open, I cast the light above my father's shoulder, not daring to squeeze past him. I cowered in fear, and my father's gasp told me that hell itself waited inside the following room. "Dad?" my father whispered. I stepped inside the room, knees quaking, and I found myself standing in a lounge, much like the one in Grandad's caravan. It was coated with blankets of hair, every wall, floor, and furnishing. Everything but the fireplace, which burnt brightly enough for me to finally turn off the torch. And there was the man himself, sitting atop a brown-haired throne with its back to the fire. My grandfather, the boogeyman. He was barely a shadow, 80 years old at the very least, an emaciated skeletal man. How did such a weak thing strike so much dread in me? "Sit down," Grandad wheezed. Simon jabbed the gun into each of our backs, and he shut the door behind us. My father and I sat on the hairy floor. Clumps of matted locks stuck to my flesh, and it took every ounce of my willpower not to projectile vomit again. Dad was sobbing. Why are you doing this to us, Dad? This is your family." "Family," Grandad repeated thoughtfully. With the fireplace behind him, he was little more than a silhouette, a dark outline, a faceless monster. And before Grandad had the chance to elaborate, Simon walked to the side of his master's throne. "You really don't know me, do you, John?" Simon laughed manically, aggressively thrusting the gun in my direction. "Why don't you tell Kara about her mother, your wife?" The light of the crackling flames danced across the detective's scruffy, patchy head of brunette hair. "What are you saying?" Dad asked. "What are you saying?" Simon mocked. "You and Rachel. You were 16 and you were in love. On prom night, your plaything passed out and she got knocked up. Tell Kara. Confess, or I'll hurt her." Dad had tears in his eyes, and he turned to me. His face explained that this was not news to him. "Kara, your mother was... Oh, I never wanted to tell you this. Your mum made me promise that I wouldn't ever tell you. But she was raped, Kara. We didn't want you to know. We wanted to spare you that story," my father said. He weaved his fingers into mine, seizing my hand tightly. I managed to smile and nodded through my tears. This seemed to anger Simon. "Look at me, John," the detective hissed. Dad refused. "Look at me, you coward!" The psychopath screamed, suddenly unloading a round into the wall. The deafening roar of the handgun petrified me. I shrieked, squeezing the life out of my father's hand. Dad quickly lifted his head to lock eyes with the crazed man standing before us. "Tell her," Simon said calmly. "You know me, don't you, John? You know me." Dad's eyes widened, and he shook his head, having realised something. "Yes, John," the man nodded. "I am the rotten thing that you and Rachel discarded at an orphanage.
34 years ago. A helpless baby, abandoned by my mother and my brother, Grandad finished. Silence followed as my grandfather's single word pierced the air. A stinging revelation. The disturbing nature of the truth struck me before my brain had even put things together. What do you mean? Dad whispered, though I knew he'd heard and understood, just as I had. Father saved me, Simon said, looking at Grandad. Father saved me from the dump in which you and Mother left me, John. Father, my dad cried, shaking violently. She was perfect, your Rachel. Grandad coughed. Perfect. When your mother grew too old to bear children, John, well, I had to look elsewhere. Rachel became the new key to my pure bloodline. Dad, face smeared with tears, started to wail. I simply continued to tremble. Don't cry, brother, Simon said, strolling over to John. I forgive you. I forgive you for abandoning me. And your pain won't last long. You'll join the wall soon. Patience, son, Grandad barked as loudly as his feeble body could muster. There is an order to these things. Sorry, Father, Simon fearfully whimpered. The catalogue? Grandad nodded, and his son, brother to both my father and me, scurried out of the room in fear. The man on the vile throne, with his back to the fire, was concealed by shadows. But I caught a glimpse of something in the demon's eyes. Joy, perhaps. A malformed type of joy. Kara, Grandad muttered, there is another thing I've longed to tell you. Something your father doesn't know. Shouldn't know. Come closer, girl. Lip quivering, I crawled across the floor, and I stopped inches in front of my grandfather's throne. The man unfurled his shaky fingers, caressing my cheek with those gnarled appendages. He leaned forwards to whisper in my ear, and his following words will haunt me until the end of my days. You are my greatest achievement, Kara, he groaned. Greater than Simon or John. Your brothers. You will inherit my gift soon enough. I see it in your eyes. I wish I'd misinterpreted him, but I know I didn't. I understood him perfectly. He was my father. I crawled backwards, horrified and disbelieving eyes stretching. I crawled straight into my real father's warm, comforting arms. I tried not to think about what the horrid man on the throne had done to my mother. Twice. Using those dreaded sweets. Part of me fears that she knew, on some deeper level, knew what Grandad had done to her. And I also fear what he might have done to me in my sleep. Did you kill her, Dad? My father blubbered. Did you kill Rachel? Grandad sighed, though it was little more than a strained wheeze. All perfect things must be preserved in the catalogue, John. Otherwise they tarnish. But I do not waste any of them. I do not waste precious things. The bloodline continues. And that is what matters. The detective re-entered the room, and I turned to see that he was holding a Polaroid camera in his free hand. Simon smiled. "They're ready to be catalogued, Father." And everything happened quickly. My father, utilising Simon's brief moment of distraction, shot towards him. Dad propelled from the floor with such speed and force that, when he collided with the detective, the two of them hurtled through the open doorway into the main corridor. And my granddad, if I should even call him that anymore, howled like a wounded wolf, supporting his brittle body on the armrests of his throne as he attempted to stand. I don't know what overcame me, but my body moved before I'd made any sort of conscious decision. I lurched forwards and roughly thrust my hands onto my grandfather's bony chest. He felt cold. Even by the scorching fire, he felt cold. I pushed him backwards. Grandad and his throne of matted hair fell into the inferno. And the withered man screeched at a piercing volume as flames ensnared him. I stood in a frozen position, witnessing a horrifying spectacle of burning hair, flesh, and whatever else formed the boogeyman. Grandad was quickly reduced to a charred mess, his remnants mostly concealed by the raging fire.
Father!
I heard Simon splutter in pain. I turned to see Dad kneeling on the madman's chest, launching punch after punch into his bloody, bruised face. I took my phone out of my pocket, dialed 999, and the rest is a blur. Dad managed to stop. He must have only been a few blows away from killing Simon. I had nightmares of the detective's corrupt colleagues turning a blind eye and arresting us instead, but they seized the corrupt detective without a moment's hesitation. I hope that monster never sees the light of day. I know he was moulded as a child by my grandfather, but I don't care. I wish I'd pushed him into the fire too. Is that Grandad speaking? Have I inherited his insane bloodlust, as he promised? As the police spoke to my father, I eyed the fireplace in a trance. I stood still for a good hour or so. Eventually, I managed to pull my gaze away and leave with Dad. I had to make sure that I'd burnt him to ashes. The man spent so many years living in the shadow, an immortal spectre that watched us day and night. I'll never truly believe that he has vanished. After all, the boogeyman is dead, but his bloodline lives.